Well, thanks for coming out on a rainy night. I think I know everybody here, but if you don't know me, I'm David Scheffler, Mayor of the City of Lancaster. And the City of Lancaster joined MORPC sometime early this summer, and I had the privilege of attending the Insight 2050 Academy, which was 6 Fridays this fall, where a number of city officials from around Central Ohio went and learned about what's going to happen in Central Ohio for in the next 30 years, from between now and 2050. And I thought it was information that people in Lancaster and Fairfield County needed to have. So I invited William Murdoch, the Executive Director of Mid-Ohio Regional Planning, to come down and do that presentation again. And he's joined tonight by Jennifer Knowles, who is the principal planner from MORPC, and they're going to tag team. In addition to that, I have asked William at the beginning to do a little infomercial about the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, because I don't know that there's a lot of understanding about who they are, what they do, what their resources are, and how they can help us as Central Ohio community. So he's going to kick that off. They're going to talk for a while, and then at the end, hopefully there will be lots of questions generated, and they're happy to hang around and answer questions for as long as you persist. So with that, I'm going to introduce William, and I'll let him introduce Jennifer when it's her turn.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. Well, great. Well, good evening, everybody. We appreciate you braving the weather and coming out to learn a little bit about the work that we do, but more importantly, get the regional perspective on what's going on in Central Ohio and think about how that might be affecting what you do, whether you're a student or whether you're in business or whether you're in government. There's a lot of change and there's a lot of opportunity in Central Ohio, and we want to talk about that. So when you work for a 5-letter acronym, you need to explain what you do sometimes, and we want to talk a little bit about that before we get into it. But I owe a debt of gratitude to the mayor for inviting us down. You have an incredible champion here for Lancaster, not just on the streets of downtown and all the great things you have here in Lancaster, but across the region. He's really been elevating the voice for what there is in Lancaster and plugging into the greater region and how you can take advantage of it. So, Mayor, we appreciate your leadership and your invitation. It's also great to see folks that we work with throughout the region. MORPC is a regional planning commission for all of Central Ohio. And that means we do different things than local regional planning commissions or planning commissions. Think of us as a value add, where we're helping to really put regional issues in context, and we're helping the region work together on big issues of transportation and environmental systems and policy for governments, and really a place where we're hoping to add value to local governments and groups. We do a lot of work with our friends at the Fairfield County Regional Planning Commission. Rick at the 33 Alliance is an important partner of ours. Fairfield County we've been engaged in. So some familiar faces in the audience, we're happy to be here. But let me talk a little bit about MORPC, and we'll do our commercial. So what is MORPC? We're a voluntary association of over 60 governments in Central Ohio. We cover 15 counties with our services. We have a board of over 100 people, and so if you like local government like I do, we have a lot of local government board members, city council members, township trustees, county commissioners, professionals engaged in the work that we do. We serve a purpose of bringing the region together on all number of community boards and working groups, and we focus on mobility, so all things transportation, sustainability, and local government. That's our lens. So the region we serve is a big one, and Central Ohio is a growing one. And when we look at this region, there's so much still to be done, so much to imagine, so much to fix and enhance when we think about transportation and the data and the maps that help support that, how we think about planning and sustainability, and how we can help local governments work together. We do that throughout this region in a number of different ways, and I want to tell you about some of those services. If you're in Fairfield County or in Franklin County, the northwest part of Fairfield County works with us on what's called the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That's where we help the region work together to figure out how to invest in transportation, fix congestion problems, look at transit, look at trails. We've got a very employer-focused way of working too, where we've got a program called Go Ohio Commute. So if you're an institution or a business that has trouble getting people to and from work, give us a call. It's one of the services we provide where we try to help get your employees to and from work reliably. In Fairfield County, we've been really engaged in planning for rural areas and growing areas. And so if you can see the map, most of Fairfield County we've been working with on identifying those needs for transportation in the future and transportation that needs to be fixed now so that we can go after federal grants, we can help the region prioritize. And this is something that Fairfield County has been a leader in working with us on, thinking about the future. We work on things like safety, and if you've walked or biked or drove your car here, you know that getting here safe is a top priority, and it's increasingly more difficult and more challenging as we look at transportation safety in the region. This is something where we work with the Department of Transportation, we work with local governments, we work with advocates on how we can make people safer as they're moving around the region. We also look at economic development, and we've got a program called Competitive Advantage, where in Fairfield County and Lancaster and other counties around central Ohio, we're working on a county-by-county level saying, what's important for economic development that's infrastructure, whether it's roads or fiber or whatever it is, what do you need for economic development that isn't funded? And then we're helping to go after it with our partners at Columbus 2020, the region's economic development folks, and really go after how we can invest in the region and get ready for it. The organization we run has a lot of people who focus and specialize in data and analysis and modeling and mapping. And so to the students out there, if you have an interest in this, come and talk to our professionals. This is something where we help the region think objectively with data and display the future and display current problems using maps. And we look at different ways to make data relevant. And so our job is to try to make it not so scary and make it accessible. Sustainability is a big focus for us too. We look at things like energy and planning for that. We look at greenways and bikeways and how we can expand and connect that throughout the region. We actually set sustainability goals working with local governments across the region. So city by city, county by county, folks have energy efficiency goals, or they have goals around recycling, or they have goals around parks. And we help local governments by giving them the tools and the recognition around the efforts that they're doing through programs like Sustainable 2050. Our work in sustainability extends really specifically to energy planning. And so the mayor said there's a map or a diagram that's hard to see. That's hard to see. We've studied the region, so we actually know how all the sources of energy plug into the region and how we're using them. And that's important because then we can look at big areas of opportunity, either generation of electricity and energy, or looking at ways to save it or identify waste. And we help local governments do this too through tools with dashboards where we work with utilities to help them be more efficient. We work in water resources. What this map is showing is we're actually working county by county to help the different water districts have additional technical expertise and resources so that they can serve local businesses and local residents better while they're trying to develop water supplies and sewers. Air quality is important too, and I love this photo because this is the downtown Columbus skyline in 2005. And the good news is we as a region have made so much progress on improving air quality that sometimes I think we forget how far we've come. This was a pretty typical summer day in downtown Columbus not so long ago. It's not just downtown either. All of that blows typically east, southeast, or northeast. And so places like Lancaster, you're breathing easier too because the whole region has been working on ways to not just improve air quality, but to help sensitive populations, people with asthma and that know when the days are coming that are tough to breathe outside. So if you've ever seen something called the air quality alert on the weather, we actually have a meteorologist that we work with who helps us model air quality so we can warn people with breathing conditions, parents of kids with asthma, when to keep them inside and how to take precautions on important days. In some parts of the region, we're actually doing sustainability services in people's homes. In over 1,000 homes around the region a year, we work with seniors and moderate to low-income families to help them be warmer and safer in their homes. And the last piece that ties it all together for us is being a nonpartisan group of local governments who cover the whole region, urban, rural, suburban. We bring them all together to find out what's important when it comes to policies to make government better and pushing best practices. And then we work with our legislators in the State House and in Washington for local governments, so local governments can be advocating for better ways to help their citizens to get in front of economic development and growth. And for us, that's MORPC in a nutshell: transportation, sustainability, helping local governments, and everything we do is through that lens of how we can make your local city, township, village, county better and stronger. And we don't often do anything else than bring those entities together so they can collaborate or give them good data. Even though our name says Regional Planning Commission, sometimes that's a misnomer because we work with local governments to help them do their own plans and figure out what the right path is for their own community while we give them the backdrop to it. So why do I tell you about MORPC? The biggest issue that's driving us today, that's needing our help, that's capturing our attention in Central Ohio, is growth. And if you know Central Ohio right now, we have about 2 million people. And if you know Central Ohio right now, many parts of it are growing faster and differently than we've seen in generations or ever. And the good news is we've got some information on why it's happening and where the market's headed. And the good news is that the growth is happening fast, but it's happening at a pace where if we plan for it and we get in front of it today, we think we can grow and still improve our quality of life and still protect the environment and the character of Central Ohio. And so that's really what we want to talk to you about tonight is how the things that we do and the things that we want to share with you should have us all thinking about Central Ohio and how we can make sure that growth doesn't overwhelm us, but actually is something that we can take advantage of. And we'll get to it, but I think Lancaster and Fairfield County are pretty well positioned to take advantage of growth and to actually make it a positive here. You'll learn that I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist, because working with data, working with markets, working with the private sector, a lot of what we're talking about we feel is something that we can tackle and we can make sustainable, and we'd love to engage with it as we get into the conversation. So let's get talking about where we're headed with growth. And Jennifer, hopefully I didn't steal too much of your thunder, but Jennifer Knoll is a principal planner at MORPC, and she has a background in working with communities on these very issues and how to get them excited and informed about growth and what that means. So Jennifer and I are going to tag team, so come on up, Jennifer, and we'll let you get started.
Thank you very much, William. Good evening. How's everyone doing? Good, good. Please let me know if you can't hear me at any time. Just kind of raise your hand and I'll make sure that I'm using my outdoor voice a little bit better as we go along here. So William talked about it. We're growing. We know that we're growing. I think we really feel it today in our communities. It's happening pretty quickly. We're all experiencing it. But what's really interesting is that growth is not particularly new for our region. We've actually been growing pretty steadily for several decades, and yet somehow it really does feel different this time around. And so what we want to talk about a little bit this evening is some of those trends that we're experiencing today and what we expect to see over the next couple of decades. Talking about how those trends are really impacting our communities at the ground level in terms of how our neighborhoods are designed to function for the residents, in terms of economic development and the way that businesses are attracting talent today. So I want to touch on all of those things, and we'd love to have a discussion with you as we get into the evening about the way you're experiencing it here in Lancaster and Fairfield County as well. The region is growing a lot. William mentioned it. We're a region of about 2 million residents today. We are setting a course to become a region of around 3 million residents by 2050. And that's not just people that we're talking about. People need places to live and jobs to go to. And so for that million or so people that we're expecting to see in the next coming decades, that's going to account for over 400,000 new households, over 600,000 new jobs. We want to be thinking now about how we accommodate that growth in a thoughtful way. We wanted to take a few minutes this evening to really drill down to what that growth looks like at the local level. What are we really experiencing here in Lancaster and within the county as well? So we've brought along a few slides. I apologize, I know they're probably a little bit difficult to see. But the key takeaway on this first slide is that we're looking at county population. So on this previous slide, I should mention, our Insight 2050 study area consisted of 7 counties, Franklin County and the 6 adjacent, which would include Fairfield. But MORPC serves a greater area than that. So what we're looking at here is actually our 15 county area of service. And so that ranges from Fayette all the way to Franklin County. And that pink bar that we see there, that's the population in Fairfield County for 2019. You can see that Fairfield's got a pretty substantial portion of our region's population already. At 6.6%, I did the math, that's a little over 158,000 people who call Fairfield County home already today. So let's take out the outlier. Let's remove Franklin County, and now we can really start to get a better look at just how much of that population is residing here in Fairfield County. You're the 3rd largest county in our region once we account for Franklin County. So that's a substantial amount of our region's residents that are living here today. What does that look like in Lancaster? So here we've already removed the outlier of the city of Columbus, but as we take them out, now we start to look at Lancaster and really that substantial share of the residential population that calls Lancaster home. That's the yellow bar that you see here, a little over 40,000 residents here in Lancaster today. And if we look back over the growth trends of the last 10 years, what we see is that this has been kind of a steady upward trend for the city. Again, we've removed the city of Columbus, but you can see that Lancaster is right there in the middle, showing consistent growth year over year from 2010 to 2019. That's a really great sweet spot to be in. That means that you've got a little bit of a gentler approach to some of these changes that are taking place, but you're also taking advantage of that competitive advantage in terms of being able to attract talent and folks who want to call Lancaster home. So let's talk about population projections a little bit. This is back to the county level, so we're looking at projections for Fairfield County all the way out to 2050. And what you can see is this is a county that is going to be experiencing some growth. By 2050, we're looking at an additional 32,800 or so residents. So if Lancaster is today a city of around 40,000, what we're anticipating is that by 2050, we could almost have the potential for another Lancaster's worth of people who are living here in Fairfield County. It's not going to happen overnight, but this is really the time to be thoughtful in how you want to plan and prepare for that growth. So not only are we growing, but we're changing. And it's really that demographic shift that's going to be setting the stage for a lot of the trends that we're going to be seeing in terms of development patterns and business and economic development as well. So if we think back maybe 30 years ago, at a time when the region was already growing, if we think about who dominated that growth, it was really led by our baby boomers, who at that time were building their families, building their careers. We saw a pretty big demand in the market for larger single-family homes, maybe on larger lots. Folks were really looking to those places where they could raise their children. Now, as we fast forward here to 2019 and then the coming years, those boomers are moving into their retirement years and becoming empty nesters. So those larger single-family homes that helped them to grow their families when they were younger may not be suiting their needs as they look for a more active retirement. They may not want the maintenance that comes with a large home. And so we're starting to see a lot of sort of that smaller household size, the 1- and 2-person households, maybe in a smaller home. But they're not the only ones driving this growth. We also see a lot of growth among our younger adults, so the 16 to 34-year-olds. And these are going to be taking up a substantial share of the market as well. But if we think about the millennials, we know they're already the largest and most diverse generation in our country. We have our share of that growth here in Central Ohio, but they're doing things on a little bit different timeline than maybe previous generations did. And so these are folks that are going to be in smaller households for a while too. So again, we're starting to see that growth in the smaller 1- and 2-person households, a little bit different from the larger family growth that dominated 30 years ago. So what this is showing us, this graphic on the right, is that over the coming decades, we can anticipate around 80% of our region's growth is going to be among these 1- and 2-person households. They're going to have different needs and preferences than the larger single-family households of the past. And so we want to be thinking about what those needs and preferences are and how we can accommodate in order to retain and attract residents. So again, taking a look at the local level and understanding what that really looks like here in Fairfield County. This is the median age by county for our 15-county area of service, and Fairfield is represented by the pink bar there. This is one of our younger counties. The median age is about 38-ish, 38.5 probably. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of young people who are probably looking to raise their families here in Fairfield County because it's a desirable place to be. That's a real asset for the communities here and something to capitalize on going forward. This shows population growth by age. This is a breakout by age groups for Fairfield County. And what we really want to show here is that what's happening here in the county is really in line with the trends we're seeing regionally. You're really experiencing that same sort of those two peaks of growth that we're talking about here in Central Ohio, where you've got the baby boomers who are moving into their retirement years, and you've got that second peak of younger adults who are looking to call Fairfield County home. This is actually a really great benefit, especially when it comes to economic development. We know that we're going to have a lot of folks who are looking to retire and step away from their positions. Who's going to fill those jobs? Thankfully, you've already got some talent that's being nurtured here and staying here that can move into those positions if they've got the right skills and training. Talking about employment, this is a projection for Fairfield County. It probably makes sense that as you're continuing to experience population growth, there would need to be some employment growth to support those new residents. Thankfully, that's what we're seeing here with the growth of over 7,000 jobs by 2050. So there's opportunities there to think about what kind of employment makes sense for Fairfield County, for Lancaster and other communities here, and how you can really capitalize by taking advantage now to make what makes sense, make the choices that make sense for you in the years ahead. So the last chart that we wanted to bring with us this evening shows household projection. Those folks who are coming to Fairfield County to live and to work need places to live, and this is what this chart shows us. So again, a growth of over 11,000 new households by 2050. Ensuring as a region that we are meeting all of the household needs that are out there. We know that housing preferences vary from person to person, and housing needs vary from household to household as well. This is a really great time to be thinking about, are we providing enough options and choices for our residents so that we know that they have a place to live at all life stages? The young family that's raising their children here today, will they be able to age in place when they reach their own empty nester years down the road? I really like these next couple of graphics because I think a lot of what we're talking about can really easily be summed up with one simple sentence. We want to be near more places, and we want more options to get there. What we're really talking about, I mentioned how a lot of the changes that we're seeing are driven by our baby boomers and our millennials. But what they want, we all want. We want to be closer to the places we go. We want a short commute to work. We want to be able to meet our friends at a restaurant or for entertainment, and we would love if our kids could walk to school. Those are really the trends we're starting to see locally as well as nationally. And the idea is that we want to be able to spend more quality time with the people in our lives. Being closer to the places we go helps to make that a possibility. And we're really starting to see a shift, too, in the way that we get from those places and to the places that we're trying to go. Yes, driving is always going to be an option, but we're finding that more and more people are starting to think about alternatives to driving. I think this is driven a lot by the growth trends that we're seeing. If we think about our baby boomers, we know that most of them, 9 out of 10 boomers, want to remain in their communities as they get older. And this is a really proactive generation that is starting to think long term about how can I remain in my community if I age. For many of them, the question becomes, what if driving is no longer a safe option for me? How can I remain in my neighborhood? Ensuring that we have options for their mobility is one way that we can retain those residents, those folks who have a lot of institutional knowledge about their community, who participate and volunteer in their communities. If we start thinking about how we can ensure their mobility and flexibility, we can retain them in our neighborhoods. Young people might be coming at this from a little bit different approach, but it might just be a different means to the same end. For a lot of young folks today, they really don't see a car as the only way they have to get from place to place. Something called mobility as a service, or MOS, is really the way a lot of young people are approaching transportation. They can dial up an Uber on an app, or they can bring up Kogo in various communities and hop on a bike share. They're no longer restricted to having to have a car, and that frees them up for other things, which is great, especially with technology and the expenses that come with it. Oftentimes, young people are prioritizing tech over a vehicle. And by ensuring, again, that they have mobility choices, that's freeing them up to be a little bit more active in their communities as well. So we talk a lot about these trends in terms of market demand, and we are starting to see a shift in the market demand. And this is, while it may be driven by the boomers and the millennials, I always like to say that those of us in Gen X really like these things too. We just tend to get sandwiched out of the conversation because we're a little bit smaller. But the reality is, many of us want these things. We want more walkable neighborhoods. We want what Lancaster has. We want the ability to go from where we live to meet our friends or to take our children to school. And we want more options to get there. And we're talking about this in a lot of different ways. Yeah, it's great that technology is out there with things like Uber and bike share, but it can be as simple as ensuring that our infrastructure provides safe, well-lit sidewalks, maybe bike lanes that allow for folks to use their bikes to get from A to B. And a lot of this comes back to the idea of a mixed-use environment. And this can look a lot of different ways. For example, again, I think there's something that's very authentic and established here in the communities in Fairfield County, that mixed use doesn't have to be a high-rise with apartments on top and retail and restaurants on the bottom. A mix of uses is just some thoughtful planning that says, you know, it would make sense for folks to live closer to the grocery store or to the doctor's office, the places where they're going to go anyway. By thinking about how we can thoughtfully integrate uses better, that's truly what a mixed-use environment is. We're also starting to see a growing demand for smaller homes, or really what I think we're seeing more for is the demand for homes that require less maintenance. This is probably driven a little bit more specifically by the boomers, and I think thanks in large part to our millennials, we're starting to see a growing demand for more diverse communities as well. There are a lot of ways that communities can approach trying to meet this market demand for their residents. We tend to talk about it frequently in terms of infill and redevelopment. So capitalizing on the infrastructure and assets that you already have in your community and building upon those so that you can really create those desirable town centers, or in Lancaster's case, kind of continuing to capitalize on that existing desirable town center to ensure that it remains an asset for years to come. So we like to show these next series of slides because they're just a great, simple Photoshop example of what infill and redevelopment really looks like on the ground. This could be anywhere USA. It's not from Central Ohio, but it's a great example of an intersection that any one of us might pass through any given day in Central Ohio. I would suggest that if you were passing through this intersection today, you would probably hope it was by car and that you were just going down the road to somewhere else. But the reality is, if we can start to think about some low-hanging fruit, some public investment that would start to create a safer environment for more people to be, the private investment will follow, and we can really start to envision a transformation of this space. So when we talk about public investment, we're often talking about infrastructure, things like sidewalks, crosswalks, street trees, things that start to invite pedestrians, bicyclists, anybody to do more than just drive through. That really is the kind of thing that, with that welcoming invitation to be here, allows people to come. And when we have people, when we have that foot traffic, that's the kind of thing that drives the private investment to follow. So it's probably not surprising that the more people that we have and the more things that we have to do here, this can continue to build upon itself. And we're not talking about overnight, but perhaps in 20 or 30 years, that kind of investment continues to build, and we start to see places to go, things to do, and even possibly places to live, all within that same intersection. And so by 2050, potentially, this has gone from an intersection where all of us were just looking to pass through to really having a town center. William mentioned it at the top of his presentation that what Lancaster has is so authentic and exists, and we are seeing so many of our communities who don't have that today, who have more of that bland intersection, who are trying to recreate that feel in their communities. It's not as easy when you have to retrofit it, but there is a necessity to have that kind of amenity for our residents, and there's a necessity when you have it today to ensure that you can continue to maintain it going forward. There are so many examples that we could have brought with us this evening, but this is happening all over Central Ohio, and it's really important to mention that, you know, it's easy to think about downtown Columbus, and we see the cranes all along High Street and all of the work and development that's happening there. Yes, but we are seeing this in all of the counties that we serve, at MORPC, and we are in particular seeing it in the 7 counties of the Insight 2050 region, so Franklin and those 6 adjacent counties. And Fairfield County is a great example. We've got 109 North Broad there on the left, which is a really nice example of some office space that's been added to the community. I love the example on the top right as well. That's the city of Newark. And what I think is really interesting about what they've done in Newark is they had a federal charge where they had to go back and retrofit some sewer and stormwater infrastructure. Maybe not that exciting, but they had to do it. And the city took that as an opportunity to really dig into some best practices. They made the changes, but then they also created this friendlier infrastructure for people to use. They put in some roundabouts around their courthouse. They added some crosswalks. Maybe you've seen Canal Market District if you spent any time there. They're really creating a there in a way that's attracting a lot of folks, not only to work and play, but to live now as well. And then that bottom example, this is New Albany, and what I think is really important to say about this is that the demand for single-family homes is not going away. Central Ohio is a wonderful place to raise a family, and we want it to continue to be that way. But we are starting to see some preferences change in terms of what the need is for a single-family home. Maybe it's homes that are a little bit smaller, a little bit more compact, or located closer to the places that we go. These are all the considerations that as communities, this is the time to address so that we can be thoughtful in making those changes to meet market demand. So with that, I think I've set William up to move into our next phase, which is to talk a little bit more about Insight 2050 and how all of this comes together.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I actually want to go back to that last slide. So Jennifer said a couple of really key things that if you just view it out of context could be kind of scary or might view with a different perception. 1 million more people in Central Ohio by 2050. That's a lot of people. And sometimes the rush to think is, well, high rises in downtown Columbus, but the bulk of that growth is going to happen in communities around the region that are meeting the market. And so when you look at the projections for Fairfield County or for Lancaster, we're showing growth. And the nice thing about seeing that growth out till 2050 is the decisions you make today in your communities on infrastructure and housing and the services you have and the amenities you have, that's going to shape whether or not that growth is a positive for you or if it just adds to congestion. And when we look at the growth in different communities around the region, Jennifer mentioned this, I mentioned it, I want to say it again. If you go around Central Ohio, if you've been to parts of, say, southern Delaware County or southeast Union County or Dublin, they are all rushing to meet the market with the things that we already see in communities like Lancaster. And I know we're in Lancaster, Mayor, and I want to say nice things about Lancaster, but the market is pushing those communities to try to build a mix of housing, a mix of amenities, cultural destinations, parks, different transportation options, and you already have that. And so I really think when you're thinking of the growth in Fairfield County and Lancaster, it becomes a little bit less scary because you're already that far ahead of where the market is going, where our demographics are going. And so the challenge becomes for the city to figure out how to take advantage of that and still make sure that you've got the character that you want here in Lancaster and that you're still able to preserve the environment and the views and take advantage of that growth. And I know when it comes to economic development, that puts you in a very good spot too, where other communities are having to invest a lot to create places like you already have. That gives you the advantage to go after the market now and be that much more in front of it. And two, when you look at the examples Jennifer showed, I think she said you could show 100 different examples of this. Every community is going to have to make their own decision. And for some, that's going to look a lot different than others, and that's okay. What our goal with Insight 2050 is to give the information so that you understand the context of why you're seeing growth in your city or your county at a level you haven't seen before. Or we talk to a lot of city councils or village councils who are seeing demands they've never seen for senior living or apartments for the first time. And the initial reaction when that happens is to grab your head and go, why is this happening to us? Well, it's nothing you did wrong. It's just demographics. It's just market. And so knowing that sometimes can take a little bit of the heat out of the equation to say, all right, well, how can we take advantage of this? How do we serve the seniors who are looking for different amenities or different types of housing? How do we keep the youth at places like OU Lancaster, thinking about living in Lancaster and working in Lancaster. So having that information, we're just trying to demystify that growth and some of the changes you're seeing demographically. This is happening everywhere, and really it should help you to feel a little more comfortable and a little more confident about how you can take advantage of it and how you can make sure that it doesn't affect you negatively. And that's what this program is about with Insight 2050. MORPC works with local governments, but we didn't want to do this in a vacuum, so we worked with a group called Columbus 2020, whose focus is on private sector and economic development. We worked with a group called the Urban Land Institute, which is a little bit of a misnomer. These are development professionals, business leaders, folks who are really interested in how to grow in a way that adds value to a community. We've worked with communities throughout the region, large and small, to really look at how these development changes and population growth. Now that we know this is coming, growth is coming, the population is changing, people want different things than they've ever wanted before. So what does that look like as we play it out over the region? And so that's where we started with taking a look at the region as a whole. If we add 500,000 people, if we add 1 million people, what does that look to the region as a whole? And that could help inform how each community might be thinking about it. We looked at different scenarios of growth, and so we looked at the way that we've developed over the last 30 years. That's what we call Scenario A. We looked at how our communities are all currently planning to grow. So part of the labor of love that Jennifer and our team had was to look at all the plans and zoning documents across the region and see what our communities are already planning for based on their own community plans and their own zoning. We looked at a different scenario about, well, what if we focus more around where the market is going? And we call that focused growth, really taking advantage of redevelopment and infill, looking at what the market is demanding with more options in housing and more options in transportation. And then we looked at another scenario, D, which is maximum infill, and that might be the scenario that is least likely, but it's one we wanted to look at. You know, what if we developed very dense and really looked at maximizing redevelopment and infill? Just to give us a perspective of where we've been, where we could go, and maybe some options to get in front of the market. When we looked at those things, we looked at it in a very comprehensive way. We didn't want to just look at development within a land perspective or development within a transportation perspective and congestion. We wanted to look at it in a number of different ways. So we wanted to look at things like land and how we're using it and preserving it. We wanted to look at transportation of all different kinds. But we also looked at things like water use with buildings. That informs cities and counties and where they're going to invest in infrastructure. We looked at energy use. We looked at household costs so that people know what growth might mean for their local pocketbooks. And being a government organization of local governments, we wanted to look at local governments and what that might mean to their budgets. Excuse me. So we've got an 85-page report online that you can really dive into this. But I want to point out two really great examples of what this told us about the region and adding people to it. So this slide is an example of land consumption. It's kind of a geeky planning term. Land consumption just means turning agricultural lands or green space into development. And we looked at this throughout the whole region and we said, well, what if we added 500,000 people to Central Ohio in each of those scenarios that I talked about? Here's where that really starts to make an impact. If we developed, as we've developed over the last 30 years in Central Ohio, and added 500,000 people the way we'd added it before, that's scenario A, which is the red circle. That would require us to take almost 500 square miles of green space and agricultural land and pull that into development. To make that even more real, we looked it up. Fairfield County is about 500 square miles. And so for Central Ohio, just to add 500,000 people, the way we've always done it, could eat up Fairfield County's worth of agricultural land, green space, and that really becomes striking when you think about the Central Ohio we know and love, and the vistas and the different types of farmland and forests and streams and parks, and that's a choice that we're making by growing the way that we've already grown. When we looked at the other scenarios, our communities are already planning to do a little differently. So the communities that have plans on the books right now, you add 500,000 people and you end up taking about half that land for that same amount of development. What gets really interesting is when we look at maximizing opportunities like you have here in Lancaster for infill or redeveloping historic buildings, or maybe a little bit different types of housing on smaller footprints. Still very much a suburban or a county seat type of development, but just a slight focus on where the market is heading cuts that dramatically. And through our modeling throughout the region, you could go from using 270 square miles, or a half a county's worth of land, to 45 square miles. That difference is a significant one. If you go even further and developed really high density, you could shrink it to 15 square miles. Realistically, we see Central Ohio going somewhere between B and C. And as community by community is looking at how to handle this, if they follow the market, we could actually end up growing, adding people to Central Ohio at an increasing rate, while not affecting the environment or our agricultural vistas and industry. We looked at it from a fiscal impact strategy too. So when you look at, again, the colors are the same with the different scenarios. Adding people the way we've always added it adds infrastructure, which is roads and sewers and waters and community services. Those things cost money, either through capital investments or ongoing operation and maintenance. What the data has told us is that if we're looking at that redevelopment or that infill strategy, if you're building things where you already have roads or you already have water and sewer, your costs are lower. And cumulatively over the region, that could mean savings over time in the billions of dollars. And we'll be agnostic here about whether those billion-dollar savings could be used for new government services or parks or amenities or lower taxes. But the way you approach growth, accommodating growth costs different depending on how you do it. And what we wanted to look at for the region is if we make a different choice, it may be more cost-effective for us as we go through. The last one I'll share with you is transportation. And this one always spins my head around a little bit. So if we grow as we've always grown, we could need about 16 billion vehicle miles traveled. So let's put that in perspective. Right now, every year in Central Ohio, all of us collectively drive about 12 billion miles in our car. That's a lot of miles, but to add 500,000 people, we'd have to add 4 billion vehicle miles to that. That's either congestion or more roads or new highways, new interchanges. If we grow a little bit differently, we may actually be able, and this is what the C scenario shows us, to add 500,000 people to Central Ohio without adding a bunch of traffic to the roads. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but if you think about it, the more that Rick and the 33 Alliance does here in Fairfield County to get jobs in Fairfield County, and that Lancaster is able to grow and redevelop, you add jobs, you add people, and you add them close to each other, that actually reduces the amount of traffic on our roads and reduces the amount of roads that we have to maintain and build. And so when we're looking at this, it's not just about saving agricultural land, it's also about, well, how are we using the roads that we have and how are we building communities and growing economically? That's something to us that gets really compelling because we think a lot about transportation. So we worked over the last, about 4 years now with community leaders, business leaders, developers, elected officials, asking these questions like, how does this information connect to what you're doing? How can we help communities get ready for growth? That's what Insight 2050 is about. So as we go into this is still an ongoing resource because we've got at least 30 years before 2050. So we've got a chance to really see where growth is going and see how we can get in front of it. Just to give a little extra perspective, so when we say we're adding 1 million people or 500,000 people, those numbers seem unrealistic and you might wonder if they're true. Just last year in 2018, Central Ohio added 40,000 residents. That's basically, we added a new Lancaster of people last year. This growth is happening, and in some respects, we think it might be happening faster than even our projections show. So we think there's actually some urgency to work with these groups to make sure that we're getting in front of it, because if we do it right, we could still be the Central Ohio that we know and love, and if we don't get in front of it, we could end up like some of our peers in Charlotte or Austin that tend to be strangled by housing costs that are super high, congestion that is unbelievably different and worse than what we have. So we think we're still on that sweet spot to get in front of it. So Speaking of transportation, we really wanted to dive into exactly what that might mean as we're planning for this growth. And so one way that we're doing that is looking at corridors. And so this is something we're seeing around the country a lot, where they're looking at corridors that maybe have some aging strip centers, maybe aren't all the way developed, but they have 4, 6, 8 lanes of roads, they have all the utility services, and they're ripe for redevelopment and growth. So when we look at redevelopment and growth, we're not talking about redeveloping single-family neighborhoods. We're looking at commercial corridors. We're looking at places where it makes sense to grow. And so we're almost through an analysis with 5 corridors at the core of Central Ohio. We picked these because they model different corridors around Central Ohio. So some people, when they look at this, they might think, is that a light rail map? This is not a light rail map. These are corridors. If you've been in this part of Central Ohio, they're all different types in here. Wealthy neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, areas that need a lot of development. What we wanted to look at is, how would redevelopment look on a corridor basis? How could transportation connect to it? How could new technology fit into it? And what might that mean? So we're modeling all this out in hopes that we get good examples that we can share in similar corridors throughout the region. It's especially important to do this differently than we've done it, because if you're paying attention to transportation and mobility, much like Jennifer said, people want more options and there are more options, but we are just on the cusp of some technological revolution when it comes to your car, and it comes to buses, and it comes to how you access transportation. Communities like Dublin and Marysville, Smart Columbus, and others have really been looking at what this might mean. If cars can drive themselves or mostly drive themselves, if buses can chain themselves together, if congestion can be managed differently, what does that mean when we're planning for communities and we're planning to get people to work? This looks a lot different, and the more we see, the more nervous we get about making sure we're planning for it differently. This is happening at the same time that we're seeing, especially in rural areas, a real need to connect people to jobs that are far away, to connect seniors to services that they need, and in town areas and urban areas, connecting people to jobs and giving young professionals and others the different options they want. All of this is happening really quickly. If you go back a couple years ago, we weren't talking about any of this. We were talking about the best way to build bike trails and the best way to build highways and roads. And now when we're looking at it, we're looking at stoplights as digital infrastructure and roads as broadband corridors, and we're looking at mobility as a service. We're looking at different types of transportation, things like shared bikes or geolocated scooters. This is something that even for those of us who like to think we're paying attention, a year ago I might not have even mentioned scooters, but if you've been to cities like downtown Columbus, there are hundreds and hundreds of scooters that are geolocated that people are using for transportation. If you've been on different campuses around the country, you see the same thing. So these things are just literally popping up as the technology happens, as they get venture capitalists investing in them. So there's a lot to get in front of here. We're hoping it does it for a purpose, and that we're planning to make sure that it's solving issues that we have, like getting people to work, getting people to services, and giving people options that they want. So we're wrapping all this into that corridor study, and we're going to have a bunch more to say about that here in the next month or two. We're going to be having a whole lot of information for communities to digest, and that's part of our role, is to help them sort through what that might mean. Because it's up to each community in Central Ohio how they tackle this and how they get in front of it. There's some other fun things I wanted to mention on transportation that affect this, and we're going to cover the whole gamut here. Why would I be talking about downtown CPAS? Well, this is downtown Columbus. What does that mean here? Well, we partnered with the transit agency and the private business owners in downtown Columbus last year to figure out a way, what if we made bus passes free to people who work downtown? And when we model that, keep in mind most people who work in downtown Columbus don't live in downtown Columbus. They live all over the region. And what we've seen is we've seen people drive to the nearest park and ride, and so the ones closest to Lancaster are really busy. I think they've seen a 16 or 20% increase in ridership. If you give people options and you make it easy to get on a bus and it goes to your job, that helps to reduce congestion. That helps to give people more free time in their day. So This is something we're looking at as a pilot that we might be able to replicate in other job centers around the region. I mentioned Smart Columbus. If you've been following it, you know Columbus won what was the Smart City Challenge at the national level. They have all sorts of aligned investment in new mobility technology, electric vehicles, how this is connecting to business. There's research that's connected to Ohio State. I know Ohio University is looking at how this affects our local communities too. We are a place of experimentation when it comes to trying to get in front of transportation. On the whole other end of the scale, we're working on a vision for bikeways and trailways. And one of the things that we're seeing community by community is when communities install trails, and I know the Parks Director is here, so maybe he knows this firsthand. When you install a trail, the number one complaint that we typically hear from communities is that their residents are saying the trail should go further, it should connect to other trails. And we're seeing a lot of pressure around the region to connect trails in new ways. And so when you look at this map, this is a trails map of central Ohio, and the purple are the trails that we already have. Think of these as the big major trails. There are a lot more community bike trails and things that aren't on this map. We already have 233 miles of trails in central Ohio. I don't know how many people knew that. I was surprised when I saw the number. I knew we were doing pretty good. But working county by county, our local governments have a vision to build 500 more miles and really start connecting. And so when you see the gold lines there, this gets in front of what we're seeing in the market data, that people want more trails. Our communities are responding by saying, well, let's connect the dots because people want to go further, they want more options. And this serves rural areas, it connects great cultural amenities like Buckeye Lake or downtown Lancaster with the trail systems that we have. If you see the diagonal line going from northeast to southeast, we're almost there in central Ohio where you could ride your bike to Lake Erie and ride your bike to Cincinnati if you wanted to do that and not encounter traffic. What we want to do is make sure that everybody can be plugged into that, so you've got that as an option either for exercise or fun with the kids or whatever you want to do. So there's a bold vision around making this possible. And then way back on the technology level, one of the things that we do in the region is we're the lead agency working on something called Midwest Connect Hyperloop. And if you've been following this in the media at all, this is a technology that Elon Musk birthed, but there are several companies going after it. We're working with the largest of them, which is called Virgin Hyperloop One. If you know Richard Branson, he's the investor behind it. To have ultra high fast transportation, 700 miles or more per hour, and we're one of 4 corridors in the United States that's working with the company to see if we can implement that technology here. It sounds fantastic, but I tell you what, we've seen the test track that they have. We're working on a real feasibility study to connect Chicago to Columbus to Pittsburgh and communities in between. We're working on the routing alignment right now. But it doesn't matter whether you're young or old, the idea of being able to get to Chicago in 25 minutes on the ground or Pittsburgh in 15 minutes seems fantastical. This is a technology that has a lot of investors behind it. It's something that's about to be commercialized, so we want to get in front of it and make sure that Central Ohio is leading the way on it. It's super fun, but when you think of what that could do for communities in Central Ohio, if you had access to those job markets as a business, as an employee, that's great. Even for cultural amenities, think how much more competitive we could be if instead of just having a Central Ohio market, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and beyond could connect to us. So this is something that we're actually really working on and always happy to talk about as we get into it. So Jennifer's going to talk a little bit about tools and resources, and then we'll get to questions.
I know we talked about a lot of information. A lot of it was pretty data heavy today. And while William and I could probably geek out and talk about it all night, it's kind of helpful to know, well, what can I really do with this information in my community? And so that's something that we've tried to be thoughtful about with our approach to Insight 2050, is thinking about and talking with our members to understand what kinds of tools and resources can help you to do more with this information. So we've approached this from a few different ways, and this is not only with our Insight 2050 work, but with a lot of the work that we do at MORPC. We really do have a strong focus on outreach, coming and talking with folks like you this evening, being able to share this information, but also to hear from you and understand what you're experiencing in your communities. We've taken that to another level with our peer learning and peer exchange. Mayor Scheffler mentioned the Insight 2050 Academy, and I actually have a plug for that on the next slide, but that's another way that we've worked to engage our members. We know that some communities are already dealing with certain issues, maybe a little bit out in front of some trends, but we know that we have others of our members that are interested in learning from those who might be a little bit ahead and understanding how they can sort of take that lessons learned approach in their own communities. So there's a lot of opportunities to share that dialogue and information and learn from each other. We have a lot of information on our website at morpc.org where we link to best practices and development resources, land use resources, many of which can be found by following MORPC's link to the Insight 2050 website as well. So we continue to build on these all the time. We're always looking for new ways that we can have these conversations and make sort of sense and meaning out of the data that we talk about. The Insight 2050 Academy is one way in which we do that. So we were thrilled to have Mayor Scheffler along with several other public officials in our most recent academy. This is a class that we offer twice a year. It's a several class-long series, and in the last cohort, I think we targeted public officials and decision makers. We're inviting public officials and decision makers again to join us for our next round, which is going to be starting in March. But we're actually opening this academy up to anybody who is interested in transportation and mobility. We're really going to have a focus this time around on transportation innovations. We've talked a lot about the various types of mobility that exist today, and we don't even exactly know what the future could hold for tomorrow. But this is the time to be thinking about how something as simple as providing safe sidewalk infrastructure all the way to Hyperloop infrastructure can be discussed in a great format with your peers and learning from leading experts across the region on these topics. We'll always hit the basics with Insight 2050, so it'll be a good refresh for you in some of the information that we talked about today, but we really like to dig in a little bit deeper in a class-by-class approach focused on some of those topics that we've talked about this evening. So I invite you to join us, talk with me afterwards if you have questions about getting involved. I think I turn it back to you for our slide. Yeah.
All right. So this is our second to last slide. So I want to make sure that we invite you once a year, and this year it's on April 18th. We have our annual meeting, and this looks a lot different than a lot of annual meetings because we always bring in a speaker who is an expert from somewhere to talk to us about what's going on in nationally in economic development and community development, and it's a great way to get a good perspective on that and to really do a deep dive into these things that we're talking about, and they're often really compelling and engaging speakers too. I guess what I want to close with before we get to questions is if we have students here, and I'm kind of blinded a little bit, do we have any students? Okay. If you know a student, one of the things that we help do is connect students to internships in local government and transportation. And so reach out to me, reach out to Jennifer, and that's something that we can help them with if they're looking to figure out what public service is or how this connects to their career. The last thing I'll say is that when you're looking at this is a lot of information, and the good news is you don't have to handle it by yourself. And the good news is there's a lot of information and data and services and technical advice we can work with communities to help them get in front of growth, to help them take advantage of it. When I think about Fairfield County, you know, we've talked a lot about Lancaster and how you've got a core that others are trying to replicate and trying to build, but you have a 150, 200-year head start here. But you look around the county and you look at places like Buckeye Lake, and what they have there, if you think about it, you add 500,000, you add 1 million people. If you're ready to take advantage of that, you could transform parts of that part of the county that need economic development or that want to make their quality of life or the quality environment better. That's what growth gives us the opportunity to do in Central Ohio. If you look at communities that we work with really closely, say Pickerington or Violet Township, they're already experiencing growth, and they're trying to get in front of it too. And so we look at this as an opportunity if you do it right. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It means that community by community, you're going to have to ask for help and to ask your residents to dig in and look to see how you want to grow and what you want to look like. The communities that are asking themselves that questions are the ones that are going to be able to say in 2050 that their quality of life is better. Those that don't, I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but if you're not planning for it, growth will still happen, and it might not be the same community that you live in now, and it might not be as desirable. So you got to get ready for it, you got to get in front of it, and view it as an opportunity. And with that, Jennifer, did you have anything else that you wanted to add, or should we go to questions? Let's go to questions. So those are our real phone numbers and email addresses. If you disagree with us or want to talk to us, we're always available, but we're right here right now and happy to talk a little more if you've got questions. Yep.
Yeah, I had a quick question about, do you see, and generally with Central Ohio, that the growth overall is pretty even, or do you see that growth is, continuing to march northwest in Franklin County and that area? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the growth, the question was, is the growth even across the region? The answer is no. It's quite uneven. When we look at the last year of data, we added 40,000 people. About 20,000 of those were outside of Franklin County. And predominantly we saw them in, I think Jennifer might have had a slide on this, in Licking County, Fairfield, Delaware, and Union. Those are the areas that are really seeing population growth. Those are the communities, too, that are feeling the most pressure on how to get ready for growth. So when we're looking at it, we're seeing that communities that are attracting growth and have been are the ones that are likely going to see the most growth. I don't know if your data shows anything else that would add to that.
No, I think those are really the key stats. I won't belabor the point of going back to that slide, but the reality is that, yes, it's not even, but this is a community that needs to be thinking about it.
Yeah, and when we talk to people in different parts of the region, some of our counties are actually stagnant or losing population, and that makes economic development really hard. And so we've got some community leaders thinking about, if we're adding 1 million people 10 miles down the road, how can we take advantage of that? And so it's not even at all. It's about who's able to accommodate it. Hi.
Mike, economic development for Lancaster.
Yeah.
I heard recently in a futuristic comment that 85% of the jobs created in the 2030s have not been invented yet. As a board member of MORPC, should we be adding a square on your focus of education and pulling the Central Ohio education community together to start looking at the skills and the things that we should be doing for those 2030s and 2050s? Dean Smith and I have had conversations about that, and would like to see the group, and I think MORPC might be that group, to start having that dialogue.
So the questions about workforce, and I forget, I didn't hear them. 85% of the jobs in the 2030s haven't been invented yet. So I know OU Lancaster, that's exciting because that keeps you in business because you'll need to keep people educated. But I think that's a great question because this is something that the region does need to focus on, and we'd love to be a part of that conversation. I think when we look at the jobs in Central Ohio right now, just talking about logistics is one of our major hubs. What happens if a lot of the vehicles drive themselves, and what does that mean for the logistics industry? When we look at some of the transportation industries that are happening, or that are developing right now, they didn't exist 5 years ago. And so we have folks coming out of college who are entering fields that didn't exist just a couple of years ago. And so this means we're going to have to be more flexible and more adaptive to get in front of that. What's really important from a workforce development side, though, is when we talk to employers, they're going to where the employees are. And where the employees are going are places that have the amenities, the housing that they need, the housing options, the transportation options. And so I think there's two parts to it. It's not just about making sure we're training people, it's about making sure that we've got the kind of environments that people want to come to live and to work. And if we don't focus on that, we could be well educated but not have the environment that attracts a workforce. If you want to jump in, you can speak closer.
I might just add to that, too, that I think, Mike, you alluded to it, the idea of how important partnerships are going to be going forward, too, especially as things evolve as quickly as they are. And the partnership that you have, that you're working with Dean on these issues, this is the kind of thing that we're going to continue to see more of across the region. That collaborative spirit is really going to be what allows us to be nimble, innovative, and flexible as technology changes and as the employment world changes with it. So kudos for starting that off already, and certainly that's something that we love to do at MORPC too, is be part of those collaborative conversations.
So just a clarification, when you had the transportation slide up there, you talked about the number of miles that we'll be driving when we see an increase in population. What does that correlate to the number of vehicles that you're going to see on the freeway? And as a commuter myself to Columbus, we feel that pain every day. So from an infrastructure standpoint, what is the state doing to assist with those road developments?
Yeah, so great questions in there. So when we look at where transportation is going with growth and how that affects congestion, one thing that we know is that if people are able to live closer to where they work, even if it's a 10-minute drive instead of a 30-minute drive, that helps to reduce congestion overall. And so there's a little bit of a burden on our economic development folks here in Fairfield County and Lancaster to build jobs for people so they can shorten their commute. When we look at connecting to the major job hubs up northwest on 33, that's something that there's a present term issue and then there's a long-term issue. So we'll start with the present term one, where there's a lot of congestion, and that makes your commute on some days probably pretty rough. Looking at ways to add capacity, that's something that I know the state's looking at through our transportation planning we're looking at. The trouble we're running into in Ohio, just to be frank about it, is the amount of funding that we have to invest in our highway and our road infrastructure is restricted, and the projections are not good. And so one of the things we've been talking about is, what are we going to do to invest in that? So for example, this coming year, the state of Ohio doesn't have money set aside for major new projects. And if you're in a place that's not growing, maybe that's not as rough. If you're in a place like Central Ohio, where we're adding 40,000 people a year, we need to keep adding capacity to certain parts of our highway and fixing some congestion points. So this is something we're really concerned about, because we can plan for it, but having to fund it is big. What gets really tricky, not to complicate it too much, but with these new mobility technologies, we don't know what that's going to mean to transportation. So some people think that if cars drive themselves, well then congestion will be wonderful. It will go away because the cars will avoid it. But there are other things that we're looking at in our modeling that say that could actually increase the amount of cars on the road. And get this, so one of the things we worry about when we're planning for congestion is called single occupancy vehicles. So one person in a car, if everybody's doing that, it can make congestion worse. We're actually studying zero occupancy vehicles, because what if you have a car that drives you to work and then drives back home? And now we're adding cars to the road that don't even have drivers in it. And so I don't want to make too much light of it, but it's one of those challenges that in the next 10 years, we could have even more complicated problems than we have now. This short-term issue really comes down to having enough funding to fix the problems we have. Our communities have actually done a great job identifying things like 33 that need to be improved, and then working on development that keeps people from having to make that commute. But great question, great question.
It seems that whether it's MORPC or any type of entity or person that looks at growth and the way growth is going and probably the way growth needs to go, talks about everything you talked about with respect to mixed use and people closer to their job, walkability, transportation. But it seems that our state, our county, and our municipality zoning, laws, regulations still are centric to everyone needs a car, everyone needs 2 cars, the suburbs are going to grow, we need to separate everything. How do you deconflict where we need to go with where all of the administration in the laws and statutes says we can go?
So that's a great question. I think when you look at how we grow in Ohio, each community has a lot of control over that. And I think that's good, because then each local government can decide how they want to grow. What we're trying to do is give them the tools so that they know how they could do it differently, and to give them the tools so that when they look at the way they've always grown, so you mentioned just kind of standard development. If we grew up in the 80s and 90s, you know what I'm talking about. We can give now financial information to say, well, in the long term, that's going to cost a lot of money. So let's look, is that the decision the community wants to make? When we talk about mixed use or smaller development, I think Jennifer can correct me, when we looked at denser development, we looked at quarter acre, was it? Or yeah, so even the kind of development we're talking about smaller residences with less maintenance, we're looking at a quarter acre or less. And so if you've been to other major cities around the country, a quarter acre is a large lot. And so really just even subtle shifts in communities can make a difference. But what communities really, we think, need to focus on are looking at the financial impact of how they're developing and then looking at how it affects everybody. And so Jennifer's data showed that the bulk of our growth are people under 35 and over 65. And that looks a whole lot different than it used to. When we look at household growth, it's 85%, is that what it is?
About 81%.
81% of new houses that we need in a region are for families without children. And that's not a moral statement at all, that's just demographics. People are young and waiting, or they're old and they hope the kids are out of the garage or the basement. And when we're planning housing, we even have to think differently about how housing is. So arming communities with those tools, and we're giving them example zoning codes, and we're connecting to other communities. The communities that are really trying to get in front of this are really diving into those questions that you're asking about.
Yeah, and William talked a little bit about the corridor study that we're concluding here in the next couple of months. One of the tools that's going to come out of that is a look at the zoning codes along those 5 corridors that we studied. The reality is that we're talking about development patterns that most communities don't particularly allow for today. And so we want to kind of set the baseline with what existing conditions are when it comes to zoning and land use today, but also take a look at what the potential options would be for those communities that would be interested in updating their zoning codes or changing their zoning codes to be more reflective of the market demand. So that's a tool that I'm particularly excited to see here in the next couple of months. I think that could really start some interesting conversations around our region as communities grapple with trying to accommodate the market demand with a code or a plan that might be a little bit behind those times. So we'll have more to say about that soon for sure.
In the back there.
Yeah, might be able to help answer that question.
Oh, awesome.
Pickerington and Violet Township, we've had to adjust our zoning codes to meet the demand, right? So, as you said, the demand is for older folks and for younger folks. Older folks don't want, want senior housing. They don't. So we're forced to. Developers are coming to us with projects that require different code and different solutions than we've had in the past. And likewise, as we're looking at building neighborhoods for the next generation, they don't want the typical, quarter acre lot, the 2,500 square foot home with a 60-foot frontage. So we're having to change the way our codes are structured, both in the township and in the city, to meet the needs. So the answer to the question ultimately is it's demand driven. As developers bring those opportunities and say, this is the product that's needed in your community, this is a product that we sell in your community, the communities are having to adjust their codes to meet that demand.
You know what's interesting about that too is when we talk to a lot of communities who are grappling with that, the first question their residents will ask are, who are these people asking for these new types of housing and who are they? And the answer when they look into it is often themselves. And so if you talk to people in Delaware or Dublin, when they're looking at new apartments or condos or those kind of things, people are moving from other parts of their communities and they wanted a different option, or they're retiring and they wanted a different option, or their kids wanted to stay close to the community they grew up in. And I think that gets really interesting when you frame it that way, because you'll have people who say will spend their whole lives raising kids in Lancaster, and then they look around and if they don't have the housing that they need, they're gonna have to leave, or they're gonna have to be in a situation that might be too expensive for them or harder for them. So this is community by community. That demand sometimes isn't this growth in Central Ohio, it's sometimes the people down the street. So what other questions do we got?
One final question. Have you overlaid household income with comparative redevelopment? So the question being, as growth varies, are you seeing that with redevelopment that lower income people are being pushed farther out, or are they actually being able to stay within
That's a big question that a lot of the region is looking at right now, where the housing that is affordable to what we might call the working class or typical workforce is further and further away from their jobs. And so in parts of the region, downtown Columbus is seeing this, other parts are seeing where people who work in the jobs there don't have housing options nearby. And that's a great concern, because that adds to that traffic, that adds to pressure on growth. And so this is something that there's going to be a bigger discussion in communities around Central Ohio as we get into the year, I'm sure, looking at how do we get in front of just that thing, giving different people different options. But do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's really the truth. I think that's a question that we hear more and more often as we talk with communities. It's something that we're studying through the corridor study as well. We really are interested in how we can maintain existing communities. With growth comes opportunity, but we don't want that opportunity to come at the expense of any residents. So it's a complex question, something that we're starting to explore, and we know our communities are digging in more on it as well. It's a good question.
We appreciate the chance to engage with you tonight. I know it's a lot of information. This is really the tools that you need to get in front of the growth, and let us know if you need anything. We're here as a resource for you. Thank you, Mayor. We appreciate you having us.
You're welcome. I would like to take my shot. Yes. Oh. I'd like to take my shot at answering Brian's question, and that is, you come to meetings like this, and you get involved in MORPC, because I don't know how many people in this room realize the growth that is going to happen and what ramifications it's going to have. Who would have guessed that 81% of the new housing was for families with no kids? And what are we going to do about that here? There are some things in the works, and hopefully we can develop that. But what we've learned, and I spent 6 Fridays learning about this in much more depth than they covered here. But I know MORPC has lots of committees and groups that you can get involved in, not only to learn about what is going to happen, but also maybe get some clues about how to address it and what we need to do going forward. So I thought it was important when I heard the presentation to have MORPC down to kind of spread the word among all of us so we know what we're dealing with and where we need to go from here. And in some ways, it's kind of scary. So we've got a lot of work to do. But thank you, William and Jennifer, for spending your time to come down on such a rainy night. And thank everybody for coming. And be sure and go out and spread the word about what you learned to your workmates, your friends, et cetera, so we can kind of get ahead of the game here like MORPC's trying to help us do. So thanks for coming. Guys, appreciate it. You're welcome.